Okay, greetings. Welcome everyone to another webinar with Reading Within Reach and the Global Reading Network. We're very happy to be providing this additional opportunity to learn all about the different aspects of early grade reading program design and implementation, and also to share experiences. We've had a really enriching discussion for the past several webinars, and we're looking forward to a discussion today about teacher professional development and coaching in early grade reading programs. We have two experts to guide you through our discussion today, Dr. Marian Fessmeyer from Florida State University and Amy Palanjo, a Reach Technical Advisor who's based in Tanzania. For those of you who have joined us, or those of you who are joining us for the first time, this webinar is part of a series called Early Grade Reading Program Design and Implementation, Best Practices and Resources for Success. We are offering 6 webinars throughout November, and if you've missed previous ones, you can find resources on our website, and we've been providing those links. If you go directly to our website, you'll see them there. This professional development series was developed by the Reading Within Reach initiative. If you aren't familiar with it, it's an initiative supported by the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID, and it's implemented by University Research Company, or URC, which is based right outside of Washington, D.C. And today we're having quite a snowy day, so although I would normally be in the office, I'm at home today. Reach supports the Global Reading Network, which is a community of practice whose goal is to develop and share research, innovations, resources, and best practices related to early grade reading programming. If you don't already get our monthly newsletter, please go to our website, globalreadingnetwork.net. If you scroll to the bottom of the page, you can click on a button to be added to our email list. We send out the newsletter as well as announcements about upcoming events and other resources of interest. So the webinar series is presented by Amy Palanjo, Aristark Limo, Adrian Barnes, and Marian Fessmeyer, as well as myself. But it's really a collaborative effort of the Global Reading Network. All of the content for the webinar was discussed. Draft versions of it were shared with members of the Global Reading Network for their input, and also to share resources with us that we could integrate throughout. So we're very excited that this really reflects what people are doing and the information that they feel is really needed now as programs in many places are continuing and scaling up. The goal of this webinar series is to provide folks who are involved in early grade reading programs with evidence-based information and research. The guidance that we collectively have thus far based on our experiences, and the resources to support design and implementation of effective early grade reading initiatives. We know there's a lot out there, and we've tried as much as we can to gather those resources that we feel would be of use to others, no matter what stage in the program you are. Each session is focused on a key technical topic and includes a summary of research to date, especially research that is from the current early grade reading programs, summaries of resources, experiences, and the different best practices. We've integrated information on cross-cutting issues like gender equity, technology, and inclusive education. We don't have standalone sessions on these because they are so important to be thinking about throughout all of these topical areas. So to the extent possible, we've made sure to mention them or include additional resources in a separate document that has references and other resources that you can check out. We've also discussed monitoring, evaluation, scale up, and sustainability within the different topical areas. Again, we know that these are issues that need to be addressed throughout, and so we've done as much as we can in the scope of these webinars to do that, as well as provide some additional resources. And as you will see throughout the webinar, we'll provide opportunities for interaction and questions. We see this very much as a discussion with you about what's working, what's not working, what are the challenges, where do we still need as a community of practice to be doing more research and evaluation, and to hear from you about the resources that you have found useful. So while we do understand there's barriers given the nature of the webinar, you'll see that we've tried to have opportunities to hear from you. We've already offered these 4 webinars. Perhaps some of you have already joined them. in the Introduction to Early Grade Reading Improvement, which provides some background, discusses the new U.S. government and USAID policy and strategy, and situates it within kind of a global context and the Sustainable Development Goals. We've discussed resources for teaching and learning early grade reading and also the skills and strategies for effective instruction and assessment. And then earlier this week, we took a deeper dive into the language considerations that run throughout different program elements. So materials for sessions 1, 2, and 3 are on the website, and recordings are soon to follow as well. Today's session, as you all know, is teacher professional development and coaching within early grade reading programs. And then at the end of November, we'll be talking about program design, expansion, and sustainability, thinking about planning for that, implementing and monitoring and evaluation. If you haven't already signed up for the last webinar, here's a link to do so on our website. I'd like to introduce now our session presenters for today. Dr. Marian Fessmeyer has 45 years of experience in education with a focus on early grade literacy and inclusive practices. She's been a classroom teacher for primary students with disabilities. She's taught early grade learning coursework at the pre-service and graduate levels and provided training for classroom teachers. During the past 5 years, Dr. Fessmeyer has worked in Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Haiti. Her primary focus has been supporting the development and delivery of in-service and pre-service teacher training in English, as well as across various mother tongue languages. She has also supported development of course modules for pre-service teacher programs and in training of instructors. Amy Palangio has more than 25 years of experience working in education, program development, and international program implementation with a focus on literacy, integrated programming, government capacity building, and cross-cutting social development models. She's permanently based in Tanzania, where she works as an independent education consultant. Amy began working for the Global Reading Network and Reach as a technical consultant in 2016. She served in roles for Creative Associates, the International Literacy Association, the Global Center for Learning and Innovation, and World Learning. And she has been, or is, a senior technical advisor on different reading programs in Sierra Leone, Mozambique, Ethiopia, Tanzania, Bangladesh, Haiti, Indonesia, Kenya, Nepal, and the Philippines. So we welcome both of our presenters, and we will get started right now with Dr. Fessmeyer talking specifically about teacher professional development.
Good morning, afternoon, and evening from wherever you are around the world. Welcome to this webinar. So the overview, our goals by the end of this session is that we'll discuss the characteristics and why is teacher professional development important, what should be the content and the modalities for not only teachers, but for other stakeholders, and then what are considerations when we're planning, implementing, and monitoring teacher professional development. And this is a great quote I really like. It focuses on how the pivotal role that teacher professional development has. And it's not only for teachers, it's for the government, administration, curriculum supervision staff, school level administrators. There's a wide variety of actors that need professional development. So professional development is a process. It's not just a one-time instructional professional development. It prepares and supports teachers. It happens over time. And some people have suggested we should look more at it as a lifelong learning process. And it's the bridge between what we already know and how we implement the new initiatives, how well they become embedded in the classrooms. So not only do we want to improve teaching practices, but we want to improve those student outcomes in early grade literacy. So what we'd like to do is start with a Zoom chat so that all of you can begin to discuss some of the things you've done with professional development. And I noticed in the last webinar, a lot of people started listing their country, which is really great because you might see there's other people in the same region or other people using the same mother tongue or other languages. So I'd encourage you to, again, write your country. And then what are some of your questions related to professional development? And what are some challenges and some successes? And what are some of your suggestions for wisdom and what has worked? Now, the first section is talking about the characteristics and the role of effective professional development. So the first thing is really important to identify the goals and make sure that it's aligned with the existing policies in the country, and there may be new policies being developed. And what are the goals for the project or the initiative? And again, who are all the key actors that need to participate? And they may not all participate in the same professional development, but all key actors will need some level of development. What are the knowledges and experiences? One of the things we know, it's really important, especially when teachers and others are learning new information, to at least, or to acknowledge some of the things they already do and what's working. And then what are their needs? When we look at a lot of teacher feedback, some of the comments are that it's not contextualized enough, they need to know more about in certain areas, and they need more hands-on. Identify facilitators. Are there facilitators in the country that have already been involved in previous initiatives? Are there people that are actively involved that could become co-trainers or become facilitators? And it's really important to look at those factors at the country level, at the local level, that can impact, can impede, but can also help and support. And then the project, since it is time bound, it's always important to think about how are we going to strengthen the in-country system so that once the project's ended, there's sustainability. And then looking at the modalities, we know some modalities may be more preferable than others, but again, it's what is feasible, what's cost effective, how many people do you have trained. And can't emphasize enough that we align in-service and pre-service. It's really important that those people that train the pre-service teachers are also involved from the beginning and have hands-on to the materials. And so one suggestion is to begin with a small scale and see how that works, and then modify, adapt, adjust before going to large scale. Handout 1 is a really great handout, and it takes you through all the different phases of professional development. And it provides questions, ideas, suggestions, things to discuss. And it's really designed so that you would do it as a team and come to a consensus, including other key actors in the process. And then who needs it? Again, we talked about this a little bit earlier. It's not only the teachers, but government officials. At the national level, you will have people in charge of pre-service, in-service, mother tongue, gender equity, inclusion, all different officials. And also in a lot of countries, there's regional officials. Who's responsible for writing the curriculum and the materials? Who's going to write the stories? Who's going to conduct monitoring and evaluation? Who's going to have oversight? And then the school administrators, the principals, the head teachers, other people that will be involved. And can't emphasize enough how important the coaches are. And again, you'll hear this several times because I work with pre-service. Looking at those instructors who provide that pre-service and in-service, they're going to need hands-on. In one country, we developed 7 of the literacy modules for the pre-service program that they're now using with the primary materials. And then school management committees and community members. In Indonesia, one of the reports indicated that the school management committees became very involved and were even providing and supporting teachers and coming to school and attending on a regular basis. So the content and the modality may be the same for for all the key actors, but then there'll need to be different kinds of professional development. For example, in Ethiopia, we had a 4-day orientation session to what is early grade literacy and what are the components, and then provided different additional professional development for different actors. This just gives a snapshot of what constitutes the teacher's knowledge and what they need to be able to implement the new practices. And we know that their knowledge is really a significant factor on improving student outcome. So the first are things that Dr. Adrian's already talked about. Also knowing the cultural expectations in the region and the country, knowing the school and community context. Is it a rural school? Is it an urban school? Is it in a conflict area? Just knowing that context. Large class sizes, multi-age. And then what do they already bring and how do they feel about how effective they are as a teacher is a critical factor. And then knowing about their learners and the belief that all children can learn. So section 2 is looking at the content and the effective modalities. This is just a graphic organizer to show the different things that have already been talked about and some of the things that are being integrated. The content knowledge, pedagogical knowledge, and the technological knowledge. And webinars 2, 3, and 4 have provided in-depth information on these topics. And then today you'll also discuss coaching. And the book, Landscape Report by Kim et al. Is a great resource, and it's available online, and it's in your resources that really provides some good information on all of these areas. And this, again, is just a breakdown of what was discussed in webinars 2, 3, 4, and 5. And as Allison said, the themes across webinars: the role of the leaders in providing support, gender responsive and inclusive strategies, and how to meet the needs of those diverse learners. And then what are some strategies for conflict, crisis, and emergency contexts, and then supporting students' social and emotional well-being. Handout 2 provides some ideas and some outlines for professional development for those other key actors. And handout 3 really gives some good information about the modalities. The cascade model is one that can be used across different types of modalities. So it's not just a standalone. There can be formal workshops, initial and refresher, large, small groups, some of the places, central location, schools by clusters, and then school-based. And then what's really important is that school-based pedagogical learning communities or pedagogical coaching. Then the learning community, there's different kinds. There's small groups, there's community of practice, there's professional learning, and then there's self-guided. So what we know is it's important that there's not one type of professional development that works for all learning outcomes, for all learners, for all contexts, and for all projects. And there'll need to be a combination, especially a combination of activities. So it's really, I know we received the question a lot about what's the best, and it's really looking at what are the key indicators and then what works for the context within the country. And in some of these slides, when you receive them, there's notes that really give you some good information on what's going on in some countries about professional development and how they're implementing it and presenting it. So again, no one modality, but what we do know across modalities, what's important is the content and the instruction is organized. And that there's time to learn, not only learn within the professional development, but support when they implement the practices and follow-up refresher. And often there's other kinds of in-service that's needed after the initial. For example, in Haiti, we just provided one on classroom management and classroom organization. Teachers have asked for and they need opportunities to collaborate and for continued professional development and support. And it's important to integrate ICT. It may be, as Allison says, just the chalk and chalkboard, but SMS, phones, all different kinds of things are happening. And that the activities are based on adult learning theory and active participation. So handout 4 is a nice graphic on adult learning theory and how not only do we need to do what I call sit and get, but we also need to hear it, say it, practice it, discuss it, reflect on it. And handout 5 is a great handout on different training tips and activities, things to engage, things to keep people active, energizers, all different kinds of great activities. So I can't say enough about that. And then appropriate and effective use of ICT. We talked about that a little bit. Mobile phone is a great literacy resource. In some countries I've worked in, people are developing communities of learners through the phones. There's resources that can be added to the phone. WhatsApp is one of the countries I work in, is really using a lot to talk across people and with us in the United States. Tablets, lesson plans, Papaya, which is a way to hear the sounds of the language, and in Kenya, the teachers can hear how to blend the sounds to say words. Videos, assessment tools, and then some interactive video conferencing workshops are happening. In Ghana, they've provided PD remotely through live streaming and video conferences. Macedonia has webinars, discussion boards. Rwanda has an online portal for discussion. So there's a lot of great things going on. And then there's self-paced course by e-tablets. So again, the content and materials, and this is some from the guidance and examples from handout 6. Make sure you identify the objectives and that they're aligned with the policies within the country, the practices, and the goals of the project. and then developing those sub-objectives. What are the resources needed? Facilitator's guide, learner books. Are the student materials available and ready? Several times we've had to implement professional development before the materials were available, which can be a challenge. What observation tools and checklists are needed? Are there videos available? And then developing those and reviewing them with your teacher trainers. In some countries we've been co-training with teacher educators and others to develop that sustainability. And the teachers and other stakeholders are involved. And then develop a final list, identify what resources are available and what need to be developed. And then making sure those assessment tools are in place. And in the handout 5, there's some really great suggestions on how to provide assessment as part of the professional development. Ticket out the door. What is your conceptual framework of phonological awareness? What questions remain about comprehension? A quick way to look at where the participants are and what needs to be reviewed and discussed. So handout 6 has some great guidance and examples of professional development, as does handout 7. Handout 7 also has some great resources to support developing materials. For example, there's one from UNESCO on how to provide professional development on classroom management. There's some on inclusion. There's just some really good resources in there. And then incentives. Teachers have said they really would like policies in some of their countries that support that effective professional development. And some are saying they just even need access to professional development. Of course, improve facilities and wages. And then an often theme used is reducing class sizes and providing support staff. And I know in some of the countries I've worked in, support staff is now being implemented. Teachers would like time to collaborate. In one country, the teachers began to develop their own time and set aside time to collaborate. In Ethiopia, the college instructors are now collaborating and taking time to go and observe each other and give feedback. They would like recognition for improved student outcomes, recognition at the school level, in the community, and just acknowledgement of their accomplishments. Certificates in early grade literacy tied to promotion, and then opportunities for promotion, and then additional classroom resources. And Kenya, in one of their in-service trainings, is doing our professional development, is providing mastery cards when the teachers demonstrate successful lesson. Nigeria, we're working on our second cohort of key actors that provide support to early grade literacy, and it's a graduate level certificate course for stakeholders. And there's a sample of our graduate certificate course in handout 8. Ethiopia had a PD for the people that were going to be the trainers, and they were giving many classroom resources such as letter cards, sight words. So a lot of people were wanting to be the trainers. So handout 8 is the graduate certificate. 9 is the online some online opportunities. In addition, last month we heard that there was going to be some more MOOC professional development available online. So if anybody knows anything about that, it would be great if you would set in the webinar Zoom chat. And then 2 other examples. Rwanda has an e-course with a web-based professional certificate with 6 months and 4 modules. And they have 20-minute sessions and then time to try it out and then share the results online. Mozambique has a professional development with an exam and requirements to complete. So there's some things going on that are really helping teachers. We have a poll, and what we'd like for you to do is just check all that apply. And again, a lot of these overlap each other, but we just like to get an idea of what's going on in terms of professional development.
No, I'm good, Marion. I know Amy is also keeping track and has been responding to people and may have a few other comments to add as well.
I think the comment about professional development. It's from Samantha. The comment about professional development often being too broad. I'm originally from Kentucky, and there we call it a buckshot approach, meaning we just shoot the shotgun and out comes the buckshot, and we hope that it hits what it is we're trying to hit. So I like the idea of really systematically back mapping professional development and looking at, we had a chat coming through earlier about making sure it's needs based, but then also laying out those needs and really asking and answering the question, what are the most critical first steps in learning for teachers in order to move them to the next step in their instruction, and to plan, whether it's a 2-year, 3-year, 5-year program, really plan out the full range of core professional development topics before you begin. So you can take the deep dive as opposed to the wide buckshot approach. Give teachers time to practice with a core set of strategies and skills and expand that over time. But that's the only comment I have to add. Mary.
Yeah, that's great. Just looking at what's the most important takeaways from the beginning, and that goes back to that professional development is a process that's developed over time. So as teachers become comfortable with those core basic materials and strategies, then looking at follow-up for freshers and looking at what coaching can provide. And then I was noticing one talked about they had kits for training in the Philippines that looked interesting. And monitoring and evaluation is our last topic in this section, and really looking at how do we monitor and evaluate from the very beginning. So it needs, teacher education, professional development needs to be monitored and evaluated, but also the student learning outcomes and its cost effectiveness. There's been some studies looking at, for example, tablets in Kenya provided to students, teachers, and coaches, and all were effective, but then looking at which is most cost effective. And then developing that plan from the beginning. I've been in situations where it's now the 3rd year, and what are we going to do for monitoring and evaluation? But starting at the beginning to monitor, how's it going? How are teachers implementing? What kind of supports do they need? What kind of refresher training and follow-up? And then there's some M&E that's been developed in some countries that identifies the effectiveness. So randomized controlled trials where there may be 2 different treatment groups and then a control group, and looking to see what is most effective. And then making sure the methods and materials match. So some examples, 3 examples of some looking at effectiveness of professional development. The first one I mentioned was in Kenya. In Indonesia, they looked at 3 models, and one was scaffolding, then a regular training module, and then orientation, providing what teachers indicate they need. And they saw that all 3 models led to improvement, but the scaffolding and supporting was the most effective. And then in Zambia, there was a control group without interventions and a second group that received 2 days of training with a tablet-based resource package and coaching. And of course, not of course, but there was much more improvement with the second group. And then in addition, recently, REACH hosted a webinar with the Central American and Early Literacy Network. I think it was about 2 weeks ago. And different people presented their findings from research they had conducted in the region. And that's available on the Global Reading Network website. And this is just a snapshot of all the different kinds of assessments that could be used in monitoring and evaluation of teacher professional development from the beginning and throughout the project. And one of the things I was reading lately, in one country, assessment of student learning, they were suggesting that not only just observing the teachers, but going over and randomly selecting some students and listening to them read. And then surveys and focus groups. In some of the focus groups we've had, it helped to have other people in the group that were also involved in the implementation, because they were able to support each other and think of additional topics and concerns and suggestions. So this is your opportunity to talk to us about what methods and tools you've used for monitoring and evaluating the different types of workshops, coaching, refresher, learning communities, and what were the over impact. And anybody who's conducting any research during any stage of professional development, we'd love for you to share that and any findings you have. I know some of you were talking about the shift to the conceptual framework as a coach. We work a lot at Florida State with pre-service, and that's a big shift too from the traditional way of presenting information to implementing actual using the primary materials. And it takes time. It takes time for learning those new materials and strategies. I know some of you are talking about how monitoring and evaluation is a key component. So some of you look like you're in the development phase of trying to identify some more monitoring and evaluation strategies. So it'd be great if you share those as you find ones that are effective.
I just wanted to add, this is Allison. Many of you have mentioned tools you have or resources. We'd be very happy to receive those if you'd like to share them with us, and we can possibly integrate them into our package here. We have found getting actual examples of teacher training workshops or tools that are used by the different actors is a little more difficult. So if you have those and you'd like to share, please do. Some of you have mentioned in the poll that you have tried different forms of technology to help support teacher professional development. And again, we'd be interested in more examples so we have a concrete things that we can share amongst the community of practice.
And add to the resources. So the key takeaways from this section: it takes time to implement new practices. It can take 3 to 5 years to really become comfortable in the practices and move forward. Opportunity: teachers need opportunities not only in in-service but in their classroom to learn and apply the new practices. And again and again, I keep emphasizing they need to be contextualized so that they meet the needs of the teachers and the learners. Making sure that that PD is organized, it's structured, it's content specific, and includes those primary materials. And as Dr. Adrian and Amy have discussed, and Allison, it needs to be evidence-based practices. Hands-on learning. I know in Haiti, they recently had some professional development, and the last day they actually went into a classroom and applied some of what they were learning. And then having that implementation, knowing that there'll be ongoing support and monitoring and evaluation throughout. And for more information, the resources and references, for those of you who are looking at conducting some research, there's quite a few references, and then there's great resources on quality professional development in conflict areas, professional development and inclusion. So some really great resources for professional development.
Marian,
Yes.
there were a few topics that came up on the chat early in your session, and I thought you might want to make some comments on these. There was discussion and questions coming through about blended professional development, how to combine and balance face-to-face training with virtual training. That's one topic. And then another topic is also, interestingly enough, a balance question, how to balance conceptual background and conceptual knowledge in training with the practical strategies teachers need to be able to implement. So those are two major topics that came up early on in the chat as you were presenting. If you'd like to comment on either one of them, blended PD and the balance of concepts and strategies in training.
So the blended PD, I've seen some, I've looked at some, and we've tried some where we would have face-to-face and then they would go back in their classrooms and try it. We would have webinars or chat rooms. We would have WhatsApp for follow-up and support. I don't know if anybody else has tried some blended. I know I've completed some of the MOOC where you do some of the activities on your own, and then there's times that there's chat rooms and times where you can have conversations and ask questions. And it's always a balance between, yes, they need that theoretical and conceptual knowledge. So I know in some of our in-service, we've gone with looking at, say, phonological awareness, doing a quick overview of the conceptual, the developmental stages, and then go into the application and what that looks like in the primary materials. Amy, have you done other
Yeah, I actually had a project that worked in both Indonesia and Bangladesh, and we used an online video library. So we did some face-to-face training, and then we would send teachers out directly to their phones a teacher study group task where they would, every 2 weeks, where they would meet with their own teaching team inside their building, and they had an app on a phone in the building where they could download video models around particular kinds of subdomains of literacy or certain strategies. And then teachers had kind of a self-guided process where we actually gave them a 90-minute after-school study group process where they studied together using the video support and the materials that were provided in training. And we did find a good uptake in terms of implementation, a better uptake than we had found before we tried that kind of follow-up strategy. We didn't have funding for coaching. We didn't have the ability to get out to the rural areas, 18 islands in Indonesia where it was being implemented. And so we had to use that distance contact with teachers and sending video through mobile apps. And it actually was quite effective. This was a number of years ago.
Well, and I noticed somebody said it's difficult for people to change what they're doing. And I know in some countries there's some conversations now about implementing some model classrooms that can be videotaped and to show these practices actually in a large size classroom. And it just takes time. And a lot of what we hear is once they begin to see the students learning and progress in the students, there's a lot more buy-in to what's happening.
So, Marian, any comments on the balance between conceptual foundations in training and practical strategies? I think people are struggling with how much time during limited training access do you spend building the teacher's background knowledge, and how much time do you spend having them prepare for practical classroom work?
Okay, I think we have some samples of some professional development training that addresses some of that. But I know when we in Nigeria provided some professional training, it was 2.5 hour blocks for each of the areas. And it was maybe 3 to 5 slides on those initial, here's the conceptual framework, here's some developmental stages, and then right into, now what do those look like? What does onset rhyme look like? What does saying the syllables in your language, and where is it in the primary materials, and then how would you teach it? And of course it's going to need follow-up and refreshers and support in the schools. But again, there's some several modules already that provide some examples of professional practice or professional development at the initial training level. And if anybody else has some that they can share, that would be awesome.
We're going to now segue to Amy, who will be following up to talk about pedagogical coaching, the on-site support to teachers. And shortly you'll also see in your Zoom chat a link to the handouts that have been mentioned in a Google Drive. This is just a temporary location for this webinar. Apologies that didn't get to you sooner. Then the final versions of everything along with the PowerPoint will be saved to the Global Reading Network website, and we'll send you a link in the next day or two on how to access that.
So I want to say late afternoon, good late afternoon from Tanzania. I am in Kilimanjaro and based here permanently. This is my home. And I am going to present this afternoon on coaching. So a nice additional segue from Marian's presentation on professional development as a broader topic. And of course, as we think about initial trainings, follow-up trainings, things that are very much more formalized. So we're moving a bit into looking at the kind of grassroots coaching approach, and how do you begin to think about how to implement that. So you can see on the screen our session objectives. Take a moment to look at those. So we're going to focus briefly on why coaching and some common approaches to coaching. Also, we've had in the chat box earlier today from Bart a question about the impact of coaching, and one of the things that is missing in many places is information on the impact of coaching. We're going to be taking a look at some of the evidence that's available about coaching in general, and whether it's effective or not, and particularly in early grades reading programs. But we're also going to discuss the need for additional research about impact of coaching. We also want to take a look at how coaches can be prepared to be effective coaches. What do they need to know? What do they need to be able to do? And then how do we need to support them as they go out into the field to do their work with teachers? And of course, just as in all of our sessions, some things to consider when you're trying to put a program together and monitor and evaluate what's happening as well. We want to let you know that we're in process of finalizing a resource that's specifically on coaching for early grades reading programs. And if you're signed up as a member on GRN, you will receive email from us when this is available with a link to where you can access it. So we're very excited that that's going to be coming out soon. So our first section in this afternoon's second presentation is the question of why coaching. So to look at why coaching, we have to really talk about and think about what is coaching. When we think about coaching, we generally think of it as an on-site kind of activity that's embedded into the job. It's less formal than training, where teachers leave their location. They usually come to a centralized area, although training is becoming more creative in terms of its delivery methodology. But it's designed to have teachers interact in an ongoing way with the knowledge and skills that they're building through training, and to do it in an applied setting, so that the coaching can have a great impact on teachers trying practices in their classroom, reflecting on those practices, and it's solid within the context of what's happening in the building. Not only does this allow teachers to see the conceptual foundation of the teaching program inside their own work, but it encourages reflection. It encourages them to be evidence gatherers, to always have that evidence lens. What's happening in my classroom? What does it say about me? What does it say about the needs of my students? How can I do better tomorrow than I have done today to address the problems that I'm seeing in my classrooms? And one of the things we know is that a well-embedded coaching program that is frequent and that is sustained can really change the self-efficacy of teachers. It can change their point of view about the importance of their role with children and in the school. And many have found, and everyone I've spoken to finds, that it is really productive for teachers to feel good about the work that they're doing, to feel that they can make a difference, and to move their students forward. So why is it important? Training is not sufficient. We all know that one-off training is really not sufficient, but even periodic training is not sufficient. If we don't have follow-up with teachers in between these formal training activities, uptake for many teachers will be minimal. Teachers can get overwhelmed by the practical environment of their own classroom if they're not helped to remain grounded in the new concepts and new strategies. They can easily slip back into similar habits that they had before, and the growth that they experience in professional development can be lost. Additionally, for some teachers, trying new methods in the classroom can be overwhelming. And so having some on-site support as they try new things, as they take risks in their classroom, is critical to send the message that perfection is not expected today, progress is expected today, and progress is expected again tomorrow, and to tell teachers that we know they can make that happen with trying strategies again, reflecting and finding ways to adapt them into the context of their classroom. Getting feedback from a coach is not only helpful for novice teachers, it's helpful for all teachers. So if we all think about our own work, some of the most valuable experiences we can have is getting regular feedback from a trusted colleague, someone who may have the same knowledge we have or may have more knowledge than we have. Helps us all to continue to grow, feel more empowered in our work, and to try new things. Also, when we look at the idea of a large-scale program or a program that is implemented in multiple regions in a country, coaching is a critical support for those kinds of programs. It ensures that there is a leverage point for implementation and fidelity of practice. And it helps us to be able to look at program level monitoring. We can gather data through coaching activities. We can check on the impact of particular approaches and strategies. We can check on the impact of the training that we've provided. And we can start to take a look at what elements of the program are influencing positive progress for children the most, and how do we leverage those as we look toward scale up and sustainability. So we do have some evidence on coaching, and I'm going to put it up here, and it's a lot of text, so I'm going to give you a moment to read. You'll notice that this evidence comes from the United States, where coaching has been in place for quite a long time. But you can see that the core information coming here is that coaching can improve teachers' instructional practices and has an impact on student performance and academic outcomes as well. In order to get those data, it really requires a longitudinal look at coaching, because you have to go from the implementation of coaching to the change in teacher practice, and the change in teacher practice from the change in student outcomes. And so that's an extended amount of research to get a look at that. And this goes back to Bart's comment in the chat earlier about how we are missing a lot of data we could be gathering on the impact of coaching on not only on teacher practice, but on student learning as well. The second one I think is a really important one. If you have coaching in place, consistent follow-up for teachers, feedback, along with monitoring, friendly monitoring, and teacher support, teachers are more likely to change their practice when they hear it from a coach who feels more like a peer and more like a person who is focused on the instructional program, as opposed to hearing this from an administrator or a supervisor. And then the last one on here is they see significant improvement in teachers' language instruction and their literacy instruction. So we can see direct evidence of the link between participation in coaching and then improvement in teacher practice. We also have some evidence from low and middle income country context. And so take a minute to look at these, please. So in South Africa, they found that coaching as a part of the learning program was actually a more cost-effective in increasing students' reading comprehension skills than providing training alone. So when you provided coaching along with training, it actually produced a more cost-effective set of results for student reading comprehension. There's a lot of people who are exploring these days in programs, really trying to limit the kind of bring teachers together in a central location and do the kickoff training or the 3-day or 5-day training, but instead rolling it out at a more local level, even the training happening more locally, and then really putting the emphasis on coaching, an expanded professional development approach at the local level. So there's some exploration going on about what difference does it make when you remove some of your time from training and you load that time into more localized coaching. In Kenya, teacher coaching, they found, improves literacy outcomes both in public schools and also in non-formal education settings. So when you're coaching a teacher who is teaching, whether it's a formal environment or an informal environment, that it actually produces better outcomes for children. And then you can see the last bullet here in Nigeria. One program that included coaching as a part of a pilot in Nigeria resulted in an increase of the number of good practices that teachers used. And so you'll recall on the previous screen I talked about this is a multi-step process to be able to go from the implementation of coaching to the student results. And so you'll see this Nigeria pilot was that interim step of research and taking a look at what coaching did to the kinds of practices teachers are putting in place, and then an additional longer-term study needed to see whether those new practices that came out of the coaching environment will result in student learning being improved. But I think we can all know that the need for much more research is critical in terms of being able to put the resources to coaching and know what types of coaching, what approaches, what content, what frequency, what duration. All those questions need to be answered still about coaching. So what do coaches do? Coaching is different really in every single context. But there's kind of a common list of things that coaches do. They will work with teachers one-on-one. So we invest some of our time as coaches in working with a teacher who either has requested support or a teacher who is struggling. Just in terms of going into the building and observing, you can see that the teacher needs help. This sometimes looks like model teaching. It sometimes looks like co-planning. It sometimes is an after-school meeting where teachers bring some evidence of what they've been doing in the classroom, and you actually use the physical artifacts to have a conversation with teachers about what's going on, what successes they're having, what needs they're having. It can also be a classroom observation. There's a lot of programs now that are using what's called a peer observation kind of process, where teachers tell coaches, here's the lesson you're going to see today, here's what I want feedback on. For example, I'm trying to ask higher level questions in this lesson. So not only observe the lesson, but please focus on this thing I'm trying to do differently, and then an after observation conversation about the broader lesson, but particularly about the requested skill, the teacher skill that they wanted feedback on. This is a very empowering peer observation kind of approach for teachers. They get to guide the conversation. They get to guide the content of the conversation. But specific activities really are relative to how many teachers are you coaching in a building? What does the program look like? How often are you there? What's the duration of that those visits? And then also the practical reality of the building. We do have to live with the kind of practical policies and structures that exist in schools in different places. And the coaching model has to fit inside the daily structure of the school and how things work in the school. When we bring in ideas that are so not a fit for the normal function of the school, it can create a lot of barriers. It can create administrative barriers. It can create barriers with teachers as well if it feels disruptive. So if you're working in a setting trying to implement coaching in a setting where there's really no room for coaching, you have to start small and you have to look for that one tiny opening in the school structure and in the school day that allows you to go in and to be of help to people. You use that one opening to leverage open a wider space for your work with teachers over time, and also work with school administrators and school leaders as well, because coaching is not just for teachers, coaching is for school leaders as well. In handout 1, which you can look at after the session, we have an overview of individual and group coaching with different ways that it can be implemented and different ideas of how to do coaching, both with individual teachers or leaders and also in small groups in school settings. So I want to ask you to do a little Zoom chat with me. And I know some people on here have probably been a coach, and some of you probably are either designing coaching models or you're implementing coaching through your programs, as we saw in the chats that you had with Marion. I want you to focus today on any one of these 3 or all 3 questions if you'd like to. What have you done? What kind of challenges did you face? And do you have advice for others? You know, we all learn by implementing and then implementing again. Many minds make lighter work. So I'd like to ask you to share with one another. What have you done? What challenges did you face? And how did you achieve success in coaching? As you continue to type, I'm going to go ahead and respond to Kathleen's statement, which is the first one up there. It's this issue that really learning from coaching and really benefiting from coaching requires us as teachers to have a self-reflection point of view, to be able to reflect on our own practice, to not be afraid to look at what happens in our classroom and not see it as whether we are a good teacher or a bad teacher, but see it as an opportunity to learn from today's practice in order to inform tomorrow's practice. And sometimes what I find, because I've worked in a lot of different countries on coaching, what I find is that this is sometimes culturally specific. And so in some places where I work, teachers are really open, even initially, to self-reflection, and in other places they're not. One of the things that has worked for me is really starting to build in the self-reflection from the very beginning, even into the training, and in some cases more so than what people might expect, to slow down the bulk and content of training. There was a chat earlier on about going deep instead of wide, and to really give teachers time to reflect inside a supported training environment about generalized practices, not their own individual practices. And of course, just as we do with young learners, create opportunities for successes in that self-reflection process. But it really is about, in many cases, changing the school environment in the coaching setting into a professional learning community. It takes a lot of modeling on the part of a coach. We can't go in and be the expert on everything. We need to be also a learner to demonstrate what a learner looks like. We need to be comfortable in that learning so that we can also show that it's okay to need to learn something. It's okay to reflect and find yourself needing to make some improvement. This is about time and consistency and modeling. It takes quite a long time to move a lot of teachers to self-reflective practice. One of the things I think you will find is that when you get them there, the sky's the limit in terms of their hunger for new information, their hunger for trying new practices, and their sense of self-efficacy as well. Elizabeth has talked about, as a coach, there are teachers who are interested and there are teachers who are not interested. And I love the comment, usually they saw the impact on student learning and they came around. Mm-hmm. And I would agree with Elizabeth. You know, a lot of times coaches throw all of their efforts and energy at the teacher who shuts their door when they know the coach is coming, literally, sometimes figuratively, others. So teachers who are just really avoiding coaching, teachers who are not interested in coaching, this is usually a fear-based response, and that's understandable because we're asking teachers to make, in many cases, really big changes. And working with other colleagues, investing some time in the reluctant teacher, but not pushing too hard. Working with other colleagues not only can start to demonstrate in the building that the things you're doing with teachers are helping them and helping children, but it also can change the broader professional culture. And you know, when we are in a positive professional culture, it's very difficult to remain outside that culture and work in the same setting. So seeing the proof in the pudding with colleagues is one way to get at it, persistence. But I think also just volunteering to go into the teacher's room and do some teaching. You know, we don't want to start observation with a reluctant teacher. We want to offer to teach with a reluctant teacher. In my history of working with teachers, I've heard many, many times that strategy may work with others, but it isn't going to work in my classroom. And that's the opening, the tiny little crack in the wall to allow you to go in and show that these strategies can work with children in that setting. Yeah, so Rita has posted the issue of helping coaches to understand that they can coach in many different ways. And we, in a previous webinar, we talked about the balance between scripting lessons and modeling lessons and teaching teachers to develop their own lessons. And I think it's an analogy for coaching as well. We have to give our coaches some kind of structure where they can begin with. One, to manage their time. Two, to bring best practices in coaching into the building. But we also, just as we do with teachers, we have to teach them to look at the evidence that's there in front of them from observation, and also read the environment. And Rita talks about recognizing that building trust is critical. They have to be able to read the environment and know, am I moving in the right direction in terms of people's comfort level? Am I bringing in the right kind of content and discussions and feedback? And so there has to be the balance in coach training, same as teacher training, between providing structure, but also having that be a flexible structure, because coaches cannot outgrow a closed box. If we want a coach to be responsive, the box has to be open, and they have to be able to dig in there for different tools. They have to be able to move in different directions and feel comfortable and confident to do that. I'm reading a few more.
While you're reading, Amy, one of the things we did is provided some in-service training for the coaches on all of those strategies you talked about, and how to give feedback, how to have conferences, and we even had simulations where they practiced those strategies.
And I think that's critical, Marion, because, you know, we are usually taking a person out of another job role, whether it's a teaching role or whether it's an officer's role or a supervisory role, and we're putting them into a totally new role that requires them to bring different behaviors. And so I think that modeling is very, very important. And Lisa put a comment up that's related to that, helping coaches move from an evaluative approach to a supportive approach. And again, she notes that these folks are usually coming from an instructional supervisor background of some sort. So she mirrors what you just said, Marion, as well. Important to make sure that people know how to behave in a way that is mentoring. And we had a question, the difference between coaching and mentoring. When you know, everybody has a different answer for this, and some people say they aren't different at all, they're the same thing. From my point of view, I think coaching is a broader umbrella. You know, coaching involves formalized small group settings. Coaching might involve bringing new knowledge, new strategies. Coaching might involve doing co-planning with teachers, observing, providing feedback. Mentoring to me is that whole individual relationship building piece that's a part of the broader context of coaching, where you identify that promising teacher or that reluctant teacher, and not only with your broader coaching responsibilities, you also, though, develop a relationship with those teachers that might be a one-on-one. And it's not always the coach. Sometimes those mentoring relationships can and should happen inside the building between more experienced teachers and less experienced teachers. And it really is one of the roles of a coach to cultivate mentors inside a building so that mentorship can be there for teachers every day. So we've got periodic formal training, we've got hopefully more frequent access to a coach in the building, but if we look for mentorship inside the building, we're leaving behind an additional mentor, an additional instructional leader when we leave that building after each visit. We have a lot more comments coming in. I'm going to read for just a second. Yes, Rhoda talks about coaching that empowers teachers to become decision makers. And Rhoda, this also goes back to the early discussion in our earlier session. I think it was our first session around scripted lessons and scripted resource use versus flexible lessons and flexible resource use. This is a constant rub because, you know, programs have to be fidelitous for us to know whether they work or not. They have to have fidelity, but we have to find a way to have fidelity within a flexible system. We all know that as teachers, if we are asked to simply implement something and regardless of the outcome, continue to implement the next thing, this is not being responsive to the needs of students. Coaches need to also be able to be responsive, but part of that coaching is to teach those teachers how to gather evidence in a variety of ways, how to recognize that evidence as being most valuable for immediate reflection, there's that word again, and feedback into the next instructional plan. And that's about changing how people view their roles, and that's about changing how people view the importance of their own thinking in their work. So this is about the culture of the building. We have several more. I'm also watching time, but I want to talk about this last comment that's here from Diane around peer-led coaching programs. And earlier, I talked about for professional development, I mentioned a project I worked on in Bangladesh and Indonesia, the idea that you can help peers structure their own coaching programs at the local level. And coaches, and I love this comment from Diane, that the coaches may have started out as kind of a leader of the professional development, but if you're using a collaborative and peer-led approach, they actually become mentors, and then other mentors grow up out of that teacher group as well. So coaching is most interesting to many people working in early grades literacy because it's about content, but it's, you know, what content does the coach need to have? But it's also about people. How you need to cultivate people to have positive response to change. But it's also about community building. And so it's a really critical role with a lot of important skills to be learned by coaches for them to become incredibly effective. I know there's so many other comments, but I'm also going to need to move us on. I'm going to ask that Allison and Marion kind of track them. And if there are topics that I need to come back to later or toward the end, we can do that. So coaching in early grades programs. So looking at it from an overview point of view. These days, coaching is a really common component. Now, 5 years ago, coaching was not a common component. And a lot of times, if you were in program development, you know, coaching was something everybody wanted to do. There wasn't a lot of financial support and programs for that. It was allowable to do coaching, but we really didn't have an emphasis on coaching. And that has changed a lot in the last 5 years from the research that's coming out, but also in those programs implemented in developing contexts where the research may not be there, but everyone who's working on those programs and has worked on those programs know that there is something about coaching that changes how teachers respond to the instructional program. So it's becoming more and more common. It's well supported by donors in terms of program implementation. It focuses on getting teachers to adopt certain instructional practices. Those are usually new for many of the teachers in places where programs are being implemented. It's different in different settings. We've talked about that. Coaching is challenging. It's challenging operationally, it's challenging financially. It's challenging in terms of scale up and sustainability as well. So we've seen a lot of programs experimenting with providing additional coaches. Excuse me. And when coaching exists as an extra or outside of the normal structure of the system, for example, hiring coaches for a 3 to 5 year period with additional funding, this doesn't make for a sustainable system. So coaching, as much or if not more than any other program component, really requires a lot of collaboration with government at the district and regional and national level to make sure that those who are selected as coaches have a clear, sustainable position in the system and can continue that work over time. One of the things we also know is that monitoring and evaluation of coaches and of how they coach and how often they coach is really insufficient at this point in time. In a lot of places, you know, we develop coaching programs the best we can. We train coaches the best we can. We give them the best strategies possible. We send them out there, but it's difficult when coaches are broad spread into local areas to really have an effective way to monitor not only how often are they coaching, but and what are they doing, but what actually is working best. So Allison or Stephanie, I know we're going to show the video on coaching in Northern Nigeria. You all are going to show that from your end?
No, Amy, I think we're going to not show that. We didn't have the greatest success last time. I just wanted to highlight it for everyone. This video has an excerpt of a coach session with a teacher, and the purpose of this video was to show different people working on a program what coaching actually looks like. As you know, often higher level Ministry of Education officials may not really understand the concept or may not, you know, be in classrooms, and this can be a useful tool to explaining to them. But also when you start training coaches or training teachers who may have no concept of this, videos, even from other countries, can be useful in showing what that relationship looks like in practice. We're
going to section 2, which is key coaching issues. And so on the first screen, you'll see some of the six key coaching issues in early grades reading programs. So first of all, being clear about what coaches' roles and responsibilities are, and making sure that those roles are the appropriate roles, and that the responsibilities are comprehensive enough that coaching has an opportunity to succeed. But again, here we also need to make sure that those roles and responsibilities are possible in the context within which people are working. So the level to which coaching has to be customized for a particular context can't really be overstated. Again, not building a model that worked in one place and then transferring it to another, but really getting to know who are the most appropriate people to be coaches, and that goes to number 2, recruitment. But then what kind of role can they fulfill? Are they prepared for that role, which goes to coach training and support? Number 3, do they have the tools they need to fulfill that role, which goes to number 4, technologies and other resources to support coaches and support coaching. And then how do we make sure that we keep them on track and they succeed over time, which is about making a clear plan, being able to manage, and then monitoring and evaluating what happens when coaches and coaching are in place. I want to refer you to Handout 2. Handout 2 is a really useful tool if you are doing coaching or if you are planning to design and implement coaching. Handout 2 has a list of the key activities that you need to undertake when you're developing and implementing coaching, and then critical questions you can ask yourselves so that if you want to reflect on an existing coaching program to look at where you may have some gaps in your design or your implementation, it's useful for that. If you're designing new coaching processes and activities and tools, it's useful to help you from the front end in terms of initial design as well. If you're coming toward the end of a coaching program and you want to take a look at what worked, what didn't work, or to address in terms of your research and reporting what was done and not done, it can help you to reflect on a program that is also coming more to its conclusion. So I encourage you after the session today to really take a look at Handout 2. It's a very useful practical tool. So when we look at the first one, coach roles and responsibilities, what do they do? Okay, in many cases, they do teacher training. Now, it's interesting that in some cases, coaches do not do teacher training. And this is all about context. Sometimes teacher training is done by teacher pre-service institution professors. Sometimes it's done by Ministry of Education at the national or regional or district level. But it is really recommended, and I would recommend very strongly, that coaches are a part of that training group. They're a part of the group that train teachers. The training group may need to be larger than the coaches group, depending upon the scale at which you're working and the frequency of coaching. But they do need to be a part of putting together teacher training and providing teacher training. When we separate training and trainers from coaching and coaches, we end up with a disconnect in the content. We end up with a disconnect in the relationships as well. Coaches visit teachers in their classrooms. They might watch a lesson, give feedback. They might do a formal observation that sometimes is used for even carrying data up through the program. They might be doing a peer kind of observation, which I talked about a little bit earlier. Sometimes when a teacher is not ready to be observed, or when the coach is sharing a new strategy or a new approach, they might model instruction, or they might peer teach together as well to provide support. Another thing that is really important for a coach to do and know how to do, and I don't see it that often, is the ability of a coach to actually help the teacher understand how to assess. And so in programs where assessment kits are provided, for example, many quick assessments like spot check assessments around the subdomains of literacy, kind of EGRA-like tools. Sometimes they're not provided, or they're provided late, or sometimes teachers don't feel confident to use them. I don't think that's an issue of the difficulty of the assessment. I think that's an issue of a particular understanding of assessment. and that assessment is for the expert to do, and that's not myself as the teacher, and how can I gather data and know what it's saying and respond to it. So a critical thing for coaches to do is to model that process of comfortable, quick spot check assessment with children. And then, of course, bringing teachers in the building together for peer learning circles or group discussions always helps to build that critical professional culture that we've talked about already. So when you're thinking about coaches, you've got to know what kind of skills do they have, right? What's the coaching skill level? What are the teacher's needs? And how do you structure and scaffold the responsibilities of the coach to target particularly, match together really, what the coach is good at with what the teacher needs, and in order to move both of them forward as effectively as possible. When you're recruiting coaches, so we've addressed a bit of this before, and I'm not going to repeat, but we know commonly those who serve as coaches may previously have served as administrators. And in many cases, this is understandable from an operational point of view, but also we need to make sure that those folks have been teachers. In my own experience in different programs, we have educational supervisors or school inspectors who have never actually taught. They are inspecting and they are gathering data about teacher practice when they haven't taught, and then they are shifted into coaching roles when they haven't taught. So everyone who coaches needs to have classroom experience, and those who have been out of the classroom for an extended period of time need to participate just as much, if not more, in the types of instructional program training teachers are receiving. So this is just some information from the Nigeria pilot, and it was referenced a little bit earlier, that there's a positive relationship between teachers' instructional practices and the number of years their coach spent teaching. And as a school support officer, which is a role that actually is an instructional role. So it goes to the previous conversation about making sure you choose coaches who have as deep and broad a teaching experience as possible, as opposed to those who have served in administration. And check your context, because in some countries, those who have served in administration or are serving in school administration may never have been in the classroom. And it's critical to make sure that a coach has been. So another kind of break from my talk, and I want to ask you a question. So we want to do a little peer coaching here and a little peer teaching, some brainstorming and sharing. What do you think are the most important skills that a coach needs to have to be successful in coaching teachers in early grades reading? We have several people who are talking about the importance of being a listener. And I think linked to that is the importance of knowing how to ask good questions, questions that promote talk, questions that promote reflection. We also had people talk about how they need to be able to respond to what's happening in the classroom. So this is not only about being able to gather informal evidence in the classroom, but then on the spot and on their feet, be able to think creatively and respond to individual teacher needs without necessarily having a menu of responses. Knowledge about how adults learn, and people who can demonstrate and share a passion. This comes from Rita, a passion about teaching and learning. So it is that issue of modeling how a professional educator should feel and should be in response to the work that they're doing. Committed, knowledgeable, and passionate. Understanding who the children are. And that's very, very important. Bringing coaches in who are not regularly working within the context is difficult because, when teachers are feeling, I'm uncertain how to do this, I'm uncertain if it will work with my children, you need a coach there who knows those children, who knows that context, and who can help that teacher find their way through to being brave enough to try something new. And we've got Mohammed and Flavia who have listed some things out for us. Context and students again, goals of coaching. I like this term mindfulness coming from Hosea. Mindfulness. being attentive and aware. This combines listening, it also combines observation, but being mindful of the situation in which you're in, and that you're constantly trying to move people to a new level of confidence and thinking, and the ability to hold the hand of the person you're coaching. So Hosea clearly has that coaching of human beings point of view, as opposed to coaching of content point of view. And just take another couple of minutes to review what other people are saying. Okay, thank you all for the great comments. And I can see you've got a similar point of view that I have, which is it's a balance of content knowledge, skills, strategies, and then the perspective of working with people and making change for people. So in terms of the knowledge and skills that coaches need to be effective, you have listed the list, and all I'm going to do is put them up here, and we'll take a look and see if we caught them all in the Zoom chat. So we've got to know about literacy. We discussed that. We have to have experience working at the grade level or a similar grade level. We have to have experience working with teachers. We need to know how to train and support. We need to know the process, and this was just referenced from a few people on the last few comments. Adult learning came up earlier. We've talked about peer learning as well. And this issue of strong interpersonal leadership and communication, I think, goes with the last bullet as well, which we've talked quite a bit about in comments from people in the last Zoom question. The idea that we have to be able to motivate people, we have to be able to support them, we have to be able to help them see possibilities as well. And we talked about mindfulness. Someone also actually used the word they need to be approachable. So you will see our bullet points here. This comes from Rita Bean, who is actually on the webinar today. So we want to send out a thanks to Rita. When I referenced Rita a little bit earlier, this is Rita Bean, who is an expert on coaching, and we're quite honored to have her with us today. We hope we do it justice. So welcome, Rita. So I'm going to take us on to section 3, which is focused on training and support for coaches. How do you help get them ready, and then how do you support them over time? So one of the things we know is that time is a problem in terms of preparation of coaches, preparation of teachers. And coaches really require a lot of time. Then they require a lot of practice. And Marion talked earlier about the approach to coaching was to spend lots of time doing modeling, doing practicing, putting themselves into scenarios. How do you respond to these kinds of situations? And then support over time around the kinds of skills that we just discussed. Handout 3 in your packet is a bit of guidance for training coaches. So if you're working on building a coach training program, or you're reflecting on an existing program, you might want to take a look at that, because it lays out some handy guidelines for what you might want to think about when you're looking at training coaches. And of course, coaches need to have, you can see all the things here on this fun graphic. They need to understand reading. They need to know they need to have the kinds of tools and materials they need to help them. They need to know how to observe and gather data. And above all, they need to be able to work with teachers. To continue along with training and support, we then need to look at, so what's best in terms of preparing coaches? Just as with teachers, and we saw in the earlier session with Marion, we need to know what coaches need to know. So we need to know what they know and what they can do, what they do not know, and what they need to be able to do. We have to give them a wide variety of ways in which to learn: professional study, peer grouping, modeling, scenario setting, practice. We have to have dedicated time for them to practice and apply what we're asking them to do. And interestingly enough, we've got to think about, as coaches are coaching teachers, we have to continue to coach those coaches. So just as teachers need ongoing support that's job embedded, coaches need ongoing support that's job embedded as well. So coaches for coaches, and those coaches coaching teachers. Training needs to be staggered over a longer period of time, maybe smaller bits of training with initial strategies and approaches, working with people more often, giving them tools and concepts, tools, and implementation strategies around particular issues. So for example, a focused cluster of coach training on continuous assessment with the tools that they need to do it, time to practice, time to model within a real life scenario, and then coaching of those coaches around that particular topic over time. So we had a question earlier in the session about technology to support coaches and coaching. Take just a moment to review what's on the. There's a lot of use going on right now of tablets in coaching. And tablets can actually accomplish a number of things. First of all, you can build a system that responds to the information that coaches are inputting. So if coaches are out in schools, they're doing a classroom observation using a tablet, they fill out a form, they choose some feedback, check some feedback comments that they want to give to teachers or some tips on giving feedback. And then those things can be looked at and monitored by the coach of the coaches to see, are coaches giving good feedback? Are they giving a wealth of feedback to teachers? And there is also some feedback tips that can be sent to them in terms of responding to and examining the work that they're submitting as a part of the work they do with teachers. An interesting thing is to find out where your coaches are going, how long they're there. This can also support if you're trying to make the case for providing more resources for coaches, providing more access for them in schools and supporting that. In some cases, we train coaches, we coach coaches, we formally put them in place, but we find out that they have very limited access to the school, just from a logistical and financial point of view. So when we can gather the data on what they're doing, how they're giving feedback, we can help them improve that feedback. But we can also gather kind of the quantitative operational data. Here's how often the coaches are in school. These schools are visited this number of times, and we can make sure we link that to getting them the kind of funding support that they need to get there as frequently as possible. And of course, data collection for the program, which we need to inform our continuing professional development. So if you have a bulk of coaches out in buildings, they're doing observations, they're having teacher meetings, they're submitting data on tablets about what are the topics being discussed in teacher meetings, what are the skills deficits I'm seeing in teacher practice in the classroom. These data can be brought up to the program level and aggregated together, and we can get a good picture of what it is that teachers need in terms of follow-up professional development and recommendations back out to the coach for how they may want to focus their work during another 3-month period or a 6-month period. We do have a handout 4, which tells you about the national scale project for coaching in Kenya and how technology has been used there. It's a great example of how a country has made it happen on a large scale, and I think you'll find it very interesting. So when we look at planning and management, how to plan for and then how to manage coaches, we need to be able to take a look at what should the coach to teacher or coach to school ratio be. This is always an issue, trying to find enough coaches, trying to find coaches that have the appropriate background and experience, and trying to find the ministry support and also the financial support to make sure we can get enough coaches into schools to keep the ratios at an appropriate level. And then how often do coaches visit? This is very different from program to program, even inside USAID's early grade literacy programs. Different approaches, different frequency. It again goes back to the question of, do we have the research to tell us what is best? We do have some research, and you can see in bullet 2, that the quality and focus of the coaching actually could be more important. Now it may be more important than the number of contact hours. So it's about the quality of the work that happens between the coach and the teacher. Seems to make more of a difference than the number of times that a coach is in the building. But of course, there's a need for additional research around all of these questions. So I want to again ask you to share, and now I want you to think about planning and management. So if you're doing coaching in your program, some of the questions we just talked about, your ratio, coach to teacher ratio, what's your general coach to teacher ratio? How often does coaching happen in your program? What's the primary process and the primary focus of coaching in your program? For example, I saw earlier in the session, someone was talking about how in coaching, they focus primarily on formative assessment and lesson planning. And that's an interesting approach, and I can see why that might be the case. So I'd like to hear from you. And then just a little note about how is it working for you? Do you have any challenges? Do you have any things you want to ask others to help you with today? While you're thinking about these questions, we do have a comment on the use of the use of technology by coaches. And we do have to acknowledge, a lot of us are working in developing contexts where power is an issue, keeping a tablet charged might be an issue, internet access is an issue. Sometimes foundational tech skills are not great among those who we're working with. We do see, in terms of looking at the research and looking at the current programs that are attempting to use technology, that using the technology to guide coaches and to gather data really in the long run is worthwhile. Coaches tend to be able to get accustomed to it, and at certain points in time they find that they actually can't really work without it. So I encourage you to try to get through those hurdles and continue to make your efforts to use tablets for coach guidance, distance communication, and also data collection. So I'll wait for just another moment if anybody wants to respond to the questions on the screen. So now on to some guidance and tools that can support coaching visits. One of the things that's critical to do in a coaching visit is to observe in the classroom. If a coach doesn't observe in the classroom, they never have actual direct evidence about whether program strategies are working in classrooms, whether teachers are able to handle them, whether they're using them in appropriate context, how students respond to those as well. In any program, you really should set a clear protocol for what happens in coach visits. We talked earlier about not giving a script, but having some structure, and that's what we mean when we talk about a clear protocol. What kind of tasks should they do during a single day visit into a building? And it's important that those tasks be able to be done in the context of the school, nothing that doesn't fit within what is realistic and feasible in the building, and also time realistic and time feasible as well. Programs need to have their own observation instrument. It should be tailored to the context within which you're working, tailored to your program, and also in terms of its structure and use, be tailored to the skills of the coach. So if you find you have a relatively novice team of coaches, you want to provide more guidance, more structure, more specific content on that observation, less, for example, open-ended commentary section, more of a Likert scale or a checklist kind of approach, at least initially. More skilled coaches can deal with data from a more flexible point of view in terms of observation. And then also the tools that they need to be able to provide feedback are critical as well. Handouts 5 and 6 have some examples of tools that can be used to support coaching. So if you're looking at how to equip your coaches, then you can take a look at those. You might find them useful. And we are actually in the middle of developing a toolkit that will provide guidance on classroom observations, including how to use the classroom observation tool in a coaching context at GRN. So be on the lookout for that coming soon via your GRN newsletter. So the last piece, the monitoring, evaluation, and research of coaches and coaching. We've acknowledged that there are some gaps in what we know about how and whether and what type of coaching has a positive impact on teacher skills, and then that secondary positive impact on student reading. And when I say secondary, I don't mean it is a secondary consideration. I mean it's the second step away from coaching to teachers, teachers then to students. So we need to be doing more monitoring and evaluation. We need to be doing more research. I think also, and GRN is really kind of helping to bring people together around this through things like this webinar, but also through focus groups and sharing of resources, what's happening in different coaching programs. Starting to look for the common elements of programs that are effective regardless of the context within which we're working, so that new programs can at least look at the research base and be able to say, at a minimum, we want to include these kinds of things in our program model, and then jump off from there and say, in our context, what are the additional kinds of approaches that we might want to use as well. So you can see here some key considerations, some key questions to ask yourself as you're working on monitoring and evaluating a program or developing a new program. What kinds of questions do you want to answer about coaching in your context? Some of these will be generalizable from program to program. Some of them may be context specific. And the front end, what tools, processes, and resources are needed. More toward the back end of a coaching implementation, how did those tools, processes, and resources work? Or how well did they work? Or which of those had the most impact on what was happening with teachers and in the coaching setting? And then, of course, to ask yourselves, how are you going to communicate the findings? Because we all need to know what's happening out there in coaching. You've got two handouts, handout 7 and handout 8. Handout 7 focuses on monitoring, evaluation, and research on coaching. It gives you some information. And then handout 8 is a monitoring tool. It's a simple tool that looks at how to monitor program implementation at the school level and use that to provide feedback not only to teachers individually, but also to teaching teams and then to school administrators. So kind of a paired and collaborative self-assessment of the program implementation at the school level that comes from a Tanzania project that was previously implemented. So last reflect and share of the day is around this issue of tools and supporting resources. So if you'd like to, could you please respond to this question around what tools and resources have you found to be most useful? This is a part of, what we just said is needed, which is more sharing of what's working for people. So tools and resources you've used in your coaching programs or that you've used as a coach that you have used and really worked, and why do you think that they worked? So for example, if you say, we had a classroom checklist that teachers and coaches did together, how well did it work? And if it worked well, why do you think it worked well? So we have some comments coming in. One of them focuses on how you can form networks of coaches. So really that's about putting together kind of a peer coaching network of coach to coach who can do that, as we see here from Rita sharing, both electronically and periodically face-to-face. So when we talked earlier about the kinds of coaching models we can apply with teachers, we can apply those same kinds of coaching of coaches models as well. That's an excellent example. So Elizabeth is commenting on this issue of knowing how to ask questions. Lists of sample questions that coaches can use to have conversation starters with teachers. Because sometimes that's about a coach not really knowing how to ask those depth kind of digging under questions, but also sometimes it's just about not knowing where to start the conversation with teachers so that you can begin to discuss the actual aspects of practice. Elizabeth makes a good point that coaches need kind of, my brain is saying a cheat sheet, but actually it's a list of strategies. So if programs have a lot of strategies that teachers are being asked to try to use or to choose from in the classroom, coaches not only need to participate in training as teachers do to know the program well, they need some quick resources they can go to that are kind of like their back pocket guide to the program so that they have it at their fingertips all the time. And if they want to pull out a new strategy for a teacher, or if they want to give feedback on a particular strategy, they've got some supporting resources to help them do that as well. Kathleen references again the importance of role play, modeling, and scenarios in order to put coaches both in the position of being the coach and being the teacher in a coaching setting. Important to understand the perspective of the other person who's in the room in order to build those good mentoring relationships. So we're coming to the end of the session, and these are what I thought really were the key takeaways for the coaching session today. I'm going to let you take a look. We do know that there's evidence that coaching can work, but it isn't guaranteed that simply because you have coaching in place in a program that it's going to work. If you look back through and think back through the things we just discussed in the hour, there's some things you can put in place, supportive resources for coaches, not only training, but then ongoing support and coaching for those coaches as well. A lot of tips and tools, some supporting resources we discussed in the last section to help them know how to quickly respond to teachers, things to give them feedback as they're out in the field as well. It's important for all of us to help stakeholders and particularly decision makers to understand the purpose of coaching, what it is for, but more importantly, what it is not for in terms of evaluation or judgment of teachers individually, the value, what it can bring, and how it takes place. That last issue of the components of coaching, it's most critical for school leaders to understand what coaching is supposed to look like in their building in order to not only allow those coaching interactions, which may look unfamiliar, to happen, but to encourage them to happen and make sure that they happen as well. Get it into context. If you build a coaching model that's not going to work within the context, it will not support your program and it will not be scalable and cost effective. Make sure you monitor the coaches. At the same time you're monitoring them, make sure you support them in response to that monitoring. You know, when we break down the barrier between monitoring and then feedback, monitoring becomes less scary for those of us who are implementing in the field and becomes more part of our regular and expected part of our work because we know that additional feedback and support is going to come from that monitoring. And don't forget that it can take coaches a number of years to be fully ingrained into their process, to build those deep skills that we want them to have, and to be very successful in their work. So I want to thank you for attending and for sticking with us all the way to the last minute of the 2-hour session. I'm going to turn it back over to Allison.
Thank you so much, Amy and Marian, for a great presentation on such a important issue with lots of facets to it, one that we see everyone is grappling with. This chat has been just amazing. I would say this has been one of the most robust chats we've had of this webinar series. So I think that really speaks to the fact that you all have experiences and questions, and it's important to keep sharing these. So do be in touch with us if you have some resources or would like to share more. If you have questions, we're happy to answer them at the Global Reading Network and any of the presenters as well. So as we've mentioned, you'll get an email hopefully tomorrow with the PowerPoint on the Global Reading Network website, as well as all of the handouts. And we hope you can join us for our next webinar at the end of November. Until then, thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you at another event.